All right, so our last lesson is dealing with 7.2 quadratic equations, but now using our quadratic formula. Okay, so you're basically just plugging into the quadratic formula, which I'm going to write down in a second, and finding the solutions with that. So a lot of these won't be factorable, even though if they are factorable, you can still use the quadratic formula to solve them, but they won't necessarily be factorables because they'll have different types of answers that you're not necessarily used to seeing. The way that we're going to simplify most of them deals with what we did in 6.1 before this with the square roots and our radicals. We'll have to do a couple of those things every once in a while. So let's look at what the quadratic formula is. So it's whatever your variable may be. So this is our quadratic formula. Most of the time we're dealing with x, but it could be y equals t equals whatever it might be. Where we're going to use this for ax squared plus bx plus c, okay, equal to 0. So whenever we're plugging into the formula, we're solving for this x right here. The a, b, and c is what's going to be plugged into the formula. So there's going to be numbers right here that we're going to plug into the actual formula. So it's negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4 times a times c all over 2a. Okay, so that's our quadratic formula. So b, that comes from right here, the number next to your x, the second part. A, of course, is your first number, and then c is your last part. Okay, so that's what all these numbers for. If there's any part, well, a would always be there, but if b or c is missing, you would use a 0. So if they have two types of directions from this lesson. They may just ask you what a, b, and c are in the first step, and then you'd actually have to plug in them into the quadratic formula after that. So that's where your a, b, and c are coming from. Then they're gonna have some that ask you to use what's called a discriminant, but we'll get to that afterwards. So these just want us to solve for x using our quadratic formula. So in this one, let's look at this first one. Just like when we were solving our factoring ones, they all have to be equal to 0. So if you have any parts of this on the other side and it's not, you do have to move them. So make sure that you do that. Let's say we have one like this. If we have y squared, or we'll do x squared, plus 3x minus 3 equal to 0. So it's already set up in our format, it's equal to 0, so we don't have to move anything over. So you just want to label out what a, b, and c are. Usually I'll do that first so that you know what you're plugging into the formula. So in this case, there's no number right here in front of x squared, so that would be a 1. So a would have to be 1. The number next to our x is 3, so that would be our b. The number by itself without a variable is the c part, and it takes the sign of whatever's next to it, so negative 3. So we're going to do that into our formula. It's x equals, or whatever variable you're using, in this case it's x. So it starts with negative b, so our b is 3, so that's going to end up being a negative 3 since the formula has a negative on it. Plus or minus the square root of b squared, so this number squared again, so 3 squared minus 4 is in the formula, times a, which is 1, times c, which is negative 3. All underneath the square root, over 2 times a, which is 1 again. So the best way to go about this is to simplify all of this stuff in the inside of the square root first. That way you can get that down to one single number, and then decide if you need to simplify that square root or take the square root of whatever it might be. So we're going to do that first. So in this case, we'll have 3 squared, which is going to be 9. And then negative 4 times negative 3 is going to be a plus 12. So that's coming from what we had on the inside of here. 3 squared is 9. Negative 4 times 1 times negative 3 is all a positive 12. Negative 4 times 1 is negative 4. Negative 4 times negative 3 is going to be a positive 12. So we have our 9 plus our 12. So that's going to be 21. So we'll have negative 3 plus or minus the square root of 21. And then we can do this part underneath here. 2 times 1 is going to be 2. Okay. Well, then you'll check 21. You want to make sure that it doesn't have any, it's not a perfect square, first of all. So you try and take the square root of 21, which in this case, it's not a perfect square. The only factors of 21 are 7 and 3 and 1 and 21. So none of those are perfect squares either. Remember, with the last lesson, we simplified our radicals. This doesn't simplify. So you can't add a number with a radical. So none of this can really change. So you can't simplify this by dividing in the 2. Sometimes you can do that, but none of this divides by the 2. They don't have any common factors. So there's really nothing else you can do with this. Now, depending on how they put it in the lesson, you can put in this entire thing as the answer. Just make sure you use the plus or minus symbol from the keypad. But it may also give you 2 separate blanks. So if you want to separate it just so that you have it in those 2 separate forms, because this is technically 2 answers because of the way the plus and the minus is. One answer would be x equals negative 3 plus square root of 21 over 2. And then our other answer would be x equals negative 3 minus square root of 21 over 2. So it's the exact same thing, but one plus version and one minus version. So sometimes you may have to separate it if there's more you can do, but you don't necessarily have to do it every time. This would have been a sufficient answer because none of that changes. So you would either type these in separate like this into 2 different blanks, or separate them by a comma whenever you're typing them into the Hulk. So it would already have the x equals, and you would just type both of these answers. Okay, so let's see a different one like that. Let's do this one. So number 2, same type of directions. Let's say we have negative x squared minus 12x minus 36 equals 0. Okay, so in this case, a would be negative 1. Okay, that's our number in front of our x squared. B would be negative 12. And C would be negative 36. Again, they're already set up equal to 0, so you don't have to change anything about this. So then we go ahead and plug this into our formula. Same formula, negative b plus or minus all of this stuff up here. So we'd have negative 12. So negative 12, meaning this would really become a positive 12. Now I'm going to write it both so you just know that that's why it's becoming a positive 12. Okay, then plus or minus square root of negative 12 squared. You need to put this in parentheses, okay, because the negative 12 is all squared, so it's going to be a positive in the answer. Minus 4 times a, which is negative 1, times c, which is negative 36. And then all over 2 times a, which is negative 1. So again, we'll start out with the inside part right here. Usually I'll do this first, this part, and then add them together. So negative 12 squared, that's negative 12 times negative 12, that's a positive 144. Then negative 4 times negative 1 is positive 4, but then positive 4 times negative 36 would be a negative 144. So in this case, 144 minus 144 is 0. That's what's going to end up under the square root. So let's finish simplifying some more of this other stuff. Negative is going to become a positive 12, plus or minus. This was 0, so square root of 0, all over 2 times negative 1, which is negative 2. Okay, well 0 is a perfect square. The square root of 0 is 0, so you don't necessarily want to keep this square root here because this actually takes a perfect square. So we're going to simplify this a little bit more. We're going to do 12 plus or minus 0 over negative 2. Well, since we can actually add these things together, you can separate this stuff now, okay? Now, in this case, since it's 0, when we do the 12 plus 0 over negative 2, or if we do 12 minus 0 over negative 2, if you add or subtract 0, it's both going to be the same thing, so you only end up with one answer because it's the same number. 12 plus 0 is 12. 12 divided by negative 2 is negative 6. 12 minus 0 is still 12. 12 divided by negative 2 is still negative 6. Okay, so there's only one answer in this case. X would just equal negative 6. Okay, so they're not all going to have two separate answers. If you get the same number, remember that's the same answer. That these answers aren't going to repeat like that. You don't put them in both. You just put in one number if they're the same. Okay, then let's look at another one. Okay, so if we have something that might end up simplifying, so negative 4x squared minus 7x plus 3 equals 0. Wait. Nope, that's not the one. That's a different. Let's do this one. So negative 2x squared plus 2x equals negative 7. Okay, so this one's a little bit different because now it's not equal to 0. So first of all, that has to happen first. These need to be equal to 0. So in this case, we need to add 7 to the other side, okay, to be able to make it equal to 0. Usually you're always just moving stuff to the left. It doesn't necessarily matter for the quadratic formula. As long as the one side's equal to 0, you'll still get the same type of answer. So negative 2x squared plus 2x plus 7 equals 0. Okay, 7 and 2x don't add up, so you would have to add the 7 onto the end. Then we can do our a, b, and c. So in this case, a is going to be negative 2 now, b is going to be positive 2, and c is going to be a positive 7. So if you would have left it a negative 7, it would give you a different answer. So that's why you need to make these equal to 0 first. So then we'll have x equals, and start plugging into our quadratic formula. So negative b, that would be negative 2. Negative b, add in the negative 2, plus or minus b squared, which is 2 squared, minus 4 times a, which is negative 2, c, which is 7. All over 2 times negative 2, 2 times a. Okay, again, we can start by simplifying this stuff right here. We have 2 squared to be 4, so we'll have 4 right here. This would be negative 4 times negative 2 is positive 8, so this is 8. Positive 8 times 7 would be a positive 56. So 4 plus 56 would end up being 60 underneath our square root. So let's start writing that out again. So negative 2 stays the same, plus or minus the square root of 4 plus 56 is 60. Okay, then over the bottom part, 2 times negative 2, which would be negative 4. So 60 is definitely not a perfect square. You can't take the square root of 60. 64 would have been a perfect square, that's 8. But this one won't work out. So you have to do what we did when we were simplifying our square roots, because this one does have a perfect square in there. So if you have the list of all the perfect squares, you can start dividing it out to find which factor would work for this. So in this case, the biggest perfect square that's in 60 is 4. So we'd have the square root of 4 and the square root of 15. So that's how you would split that up like we did on chapter 6. Then we can change this to negative 2 plus or minus. The square root of 4 would be 2. And then we can't take the square root of 15. So this part is 2, but we can't take the square root of 15. That stays the same. So you would just leave square root of 15 next to it. All over negative 4. Okay. So we still can't add the top together, but now there's stuff that will simplify. You can't simplify stuff that's underneath the square root anymore. Like you can't do 4 into 15, but if there's something on the outside, and if all 3 of them work out, you can divide out by their common factor. So 2, 2, and 4 all divide out by 2. So that's what we need to divide this out by for their common factor. So we're going to take, and since the top and the bottom is negative, we're going to change that into a positive 2. Negative over a negative is really a positive. So 2 divided by 2 is going to be 1, so we'll have positive 1 plus or minus. 2 divided by 2 is also 1, but since we already have the square root of 15 there, we'll leave it as square root of 15. Don't put the 1 in front of that. It's understood. And then over negative 4 divided by negative 2 would also be positive 2. Okay, so then once that's all simplified, then you can separate to get your 1 plus square root of 15 over 2 and your 1 minus square root of 15 over 2 as your two answers. You would put these in, or you would have put this in together with the plus and the minus. Okay, but you can't go any further than that. 1 can't add with our square root of 15. Okay, so then one more thing that they're going to ask is to use the discriminant to determine what types of solutions they have. So you want to use that. It's called your discriminant. And you're going to use it to determine all of your solutions. So it's basically part of your quadratic formula. B squared minus 4ac is your discriminant. So this is going to give you an actual number. Technically, it's already part of the quadratic formula, so you don't necessarily have to redo it when you're doing the quadratic formula, but you would do this step first if it's asking you to do it. So what this does is that it tells us the number and types of solutions. Okay, so if this number, so this is going to end up giving us a number, if that number, b squared minus 4ac, is bigger than 0, or basically a positive number, then you're going to have number of solutions. You're going to have 2 real solutions. Okay, so 2 real solutions. If that number is equal to 0, okay, that means you're only going to have 1 real, I think they say repeated solution, or double root solution. Okay, but it's still real, but this one would only have 1. Now, we're only going to really deal with the 2 and the 1, but they're going to still give you 3 options to choose from, but you should never come out with the third option, where if you would get the discriminant b squared minus 4ac less than 0, or in other words, if it comes out negative, then you probably did something wrong. They shouldn't have anything to do with any negatives, because that would be too imaginary solutions. Okay, so we're not going to deal with the imaginary or the non-real solutions, so you won't have anything to do with that. So if you come out with a negative, you probably did something wrong. So, but they're still going to give you this option in the computer, like they'll have 3 circles to choose from. So you don't want to, you're probably never going to click on that third one. You're always going to click on either the first one or the second one. So just keep that in mind. If you got a negative, it would probably be something wrong there. Okay, so if we had, let's say this. So they want us to use the discriminant to determine the solutions and then solve. So we're still going to be solving using the quadratic formula, but we're going to do part of the quadratic formula already. So technically we're not doing too much extra. You just have to determine the solutions first and then solve it afterwards. So first they'll give us one like this. So they'll say negative x squared plus 7x plus 4 equals 0. So you can do the same kind of thing. You want to label out what A, B, and C are. So in this case, A is going to be -1, B is going to be 7, and C is going to be 4. Well, for these, we're finding the discriminant first. okay, which is that b squared minus 4ac. So you're just plugging into this part of the formula first. So we have b as 7, so we're going to do 7 squared minus 4 times a, which is negative 1, times c, which is 4. Okay, giving us this is 49. And then we'd have this being positive 4 times 4, which is going to be a positive 16. So 65 would be our discriminant. Okay, so this is our discriminant part. You're not necessarily going to have to put this in anywhere. They just want you to use it to determine the solutions. So it's definitely a positive number. Okay, it's not 0, not negative. So you'd have 2 real solutions. So that's what you would click on. Okay, so that would be your part 1 answer, your first answer that they'd ask for. Okay, use the discriminant to determine that. Then sometimes it may give you a step 2, or once you click on 2 solutions, you'd have 2 boxes open up, okay, and you would have to enter in the 2 answers. Well, that's where you'll have to use the rest of the quadratic formula to figure that out. So now we'll use the quadratic formula to determine the actual solutions. So first you're finding the discriminant using that, then you're using your quadratic formula. So you're taking the same stuff. This is going to be x equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac, all of that stuff. So b is still 7, but it's going to be negative b, so negative 7, plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac. Well, if you notice, b squared minus 4ac is the discriminant. So technically, we only have to use what we already found. We would just put 65 under here instead of having to do more work for ourselves. You would get 65 anyway. That is already b squared minus 4ac. So you have a little bit less to do when you're plugging it into the formula over 2 times a, which is 2 times negative 1. Okay. Then you would see if you can factor this out, which 65 doesn't have any perfect squares in it. It won't factor out. So you would just separate it into your 2 answers, but first we'd simplify this part. So x would equal negative 7 plus or minus the square root of 65 over negative 2. And then our 2 answers would be negative 7 plus square root of 65 over negative 2. And negative 7 minus square root of 65 over negative 2. Okay. Now, since these are both negative, you can also make that into a positive. I don't think the computer's going to mark it wrong either way, as long as you type in both negatives. I'll just type them all one in. Okay. So let's do one with the 0. The other type, if you have, let's say, so this is our second one, same thing, we're finding the discriminant first, and we're going to use that. So we have negative 4x squared equals negative 4x plus 1. So they want us to find the discriminant of that first, and then solve it and put what your solutions are, okay? So in these, you still have to have them equal to 0, so you can't have this stuff on our side over here. So either you can move them both to the left, or you can move this part one over to the right. If you're used to moving stuff to the left, you can stick to that. You would change these by changing the sign of them and moving them to that side. So this would become negative 4x squared plus 4x minus 1, and then equals 0 now, since all this would cancel out. Okay, so then our A, B, and C are going to be negative 4, positive 4, and then negative 1. So let's find our discriminant first. We have, let's say, b squared minus 4ac. So b squared is 4 squared minus 4 times a is negative 4, c is negative 1. Okay, so that would be positive 16 minus 16, which is 0. So this is not greater than 0, this is actual 0, so this is where you'll have one real solution. Okay, so this is your second option, so that's what you would click on for that. Then once you click on that one real solution, you have to find out what it is using the actual formula. So now we'll set this into the formula. negative b, b is 4, so negative 4 plus or minus the square root of our discriminant, which is 0, over 2 times negative 4. So in this case, our square root is 0, which is just 0. So when we simplify that part, we're going to have negative 4 plus or minus 0 over 2 times negative 4, which is negative 8. Well, when we separate that, again, same thing we did earlier. The negative 4 plus 0 over negative 8 is the same thing as negative 4 minus 0 over negative 8, so we should get the same answer. Negative 4 plus 0 is negative 4, so negative 4 over negative 8. This is going to be a positive 1/2. Same thing right here, positive 1/2. So your one answer would be positive 1 over 2. Okay, so that's our 7.2 section.